Good afternoon. My name is Nisa Maki, and I'm the Director and Curator of Education and Public Programs here at the Walker Arts Centre. And it's a pleasure to welcome you to Day 1 of Avant Museology, a two-day symposium that will engage the sociological and political implications and possibilities of museums. I'd like to acknowledge and thank our co-presenters, eFlux and the University of Minnesota Press, and in particular, Anton Vidokler, Brian Kwan Wood, KK Nielsen, and Amal Issa from eFlux, Doug Amato, Peter Martin, and Emily Hamilton from the press. And I'd also like to acknowledge the work of all of the staff at the Walker that made this event happen, particularly Fionn Mead, Misa Jeffreys, our curatorial assistant in Visual Arts and Public Programs Associate, as well as Yash Stefanski from our design department, who created the wonderful design that you can see in our program on the slides and and online. So one of the key prompts for this symposium came from the publication of Avant-Garde Museology by our co-presenters, which was edited by our first speaker today, Arseny Zhilyaev. For those of you interested in purchasing a copy of the book, we'll be giving a 20% discount to ticket holders, and the book can be purchased just outside in our little shop, which is across the way. So without further ado, I'm going to invite Brian and Anton to deliver some opening remarks and make our first introductions. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Anton. I work at eFlux. Thank you so much for coming. I know some of you came from Texas or drove 4 hours to come to this conference. It's really, really nice that you did that. Avant-Garde Museology, researched and edited by artist Arseny Zhilyaev, is the first title in eFlux Classics, a new book series aiming to open the story of art to the full complexity and paradoxality of artistic thought. The contemporary museum might be the most advanced recording device ever invented. It is a place for the storage of historical grievances and the memory of forgotten artistic experiments, social projects, or errant futures. But a museum can also be the very tomb where these projects are declared dead and laid to rest, joining other elements of the past, despotic kings and their belongings, and old orders stretching back centuries, perfectly preserved. This is why many artists of the early Russian avant-garde in the years surrounding 1917 October Revolution called for the destruction of the museum as fortress of history that could only hinder the creation of an entirely new culture. Life in all its vitality must supersede art. But artists were not the only ones who realized something had to be done with the museum. Around the same time, in Russia, a number of others joined artists such as Malevich in realizing the meaning and purpose of the museum, in realizing that the meaning and purpose of the museum had to be reinvented. For Arseny Zhilyaev, these were the avant-garde museologists, a disparate group of state officials, art historians, writers, philosophers, and amateur scientists who identified the museum as a crucial site to be placed in the service of the collective production of life. While some of these thinkers are little known or completely unknown, both to readers today and to each other in their own lifetime, their placement in the avant-garde museology, alongside the encompassing influences of Vladimir Lenin, Kazimir Malevich, and Nikolai Fyodorov, distinguishes for the first time a mature line of thinking running through early Soviet history and society. For the editor, Arseny Zhilyaev, the avant-garde museologists can be said to have exceeded the magnitude and imaginative scope of the early artistic avant-gardes themselves. They internalized the critique of the museum voiced by artists and sought to advance its pedagogical function accordingly. If Malevich himself called for a museum of life to replace the incinerated remains of the backward past, the avant-garde museologists further asked how such a museum of life would be realized, whether through museology and curation or philosophically and temporally. The two-part symposium, the first part of which took place in New York last weekend, and the second part in Minneapolis, is organized jointly with the Walker Art Center and hosted by the Walker Art Center and Brooklyn Museum. It takes the Avant-Garde Museology book as a point of departure for a conversation about contemporary museums and the role of art, exhibitions, and museums in society today, a question that is made ever more urgent by the events of last week, as we try to understand what can people in the arts contribute to the struggle against rising nationalism, racism, and fascism. Tomorrow, I would like to thank Arseny Zhilyaev, the editor of this book, the University of Minnesota Press, and especially Peter Martin and Douglas Amato, Cadiz Foundation and Victoria Foundation for all the work and support they put into this book. Of course, Walker Art Center, Fionn Mead, Nisa Mackey, and Misa, who helped organize the symposium, and then of course Amal Issa and Kane Nielsen from eFlux for doing a lot of organizational work on this event and the Brooklyn counterpart of it, as well as Erica Love and Joao and Shuto for doing live coverage of this symposium on eFlux Conversations. We're especially grateful to all of the participants who agreed to come and take part in this. Thank you very much, and maybe Brian will say a few words now.
Thanks to everyone for coming. So in the first iteration of this conference, kind of a dress rehearsal for what we are beginning now. The first iteration last weekend at the Brooklyn Museum, we were a bit worried because it came at the end of this election cycle, and we were wondering what does museology have to do with what is obviously on everyone's mind. And so we tried to address it a bit, but it seemed also that people in Brooklyn were more interested in just in also just focusing on the topic at hand. But in fact, they are not so far away, and the design of the conference, it departs from Arseny Zhilyaev's book, Avant-Garde Museology, but then it expands outward to try to think about what is really happening with the boom of museum building happening now. What is this new life being given to cultural history, to national history in pseudo-sovereign or non-sovereign territories in the Middle East, in Asia? You see museums going up like crazy everywhere, right? Historical museums, contemporary art museums. So the implicit question, and many of the lectures and talks you'll see, is what is this new history that is being written now under the regime of contemporary art or under the regime of cultural heritage, right? So this is something to think about. Before I introduce Arseny, or by way of introduction, I would like to just read a short quote by Nikolai Fyodorov, who is one of the most important writers for the book, but also for this kind of the scope of thinking that it expresses. And this was in the 1880s. Nikolai Fyodorov wrote, "And our age in no way dares to imagine that progress itself would ever become the achievement of history. And this grave, this museum, becomes a reconstruction of all of progress's victims at a time when struggle will be supplanted by accord and unity in the purpose of reconstruction, only in which parties of progressives and conservatives can be reconciled, parties that have been warring since the beginning of history." So for Fyodorov, the idea of the museum is some kind of a strange, almost metaphysical entity that can unify progressives and conservatives, progress and conservation, and which is also a way of unifying vitality, life and death. So, work on that one. But just to introduce Arseny Zhilyaev, the editor of Avant-Garde Museology. Arseny Zhilyaev is an artist who lives in Moscow and Voronezh. Zhilyaev has presented recent exhibitions at venues such as Moderna Galeria, Ljubljana, Centre Pompidou, Paris, the Apple, Amsterdam, the 9th edition of Liverpool Biennial, and the 13th edition of the Biennale de Lyon. Zhilyaev is the editor of Avant Museology, and he has been on the editorial board of Moscow Art Magazine since 2011. Recent accolades include Russian awards in the sphere of contemporary art and a nomination for the Visible Award in 2013. Join me in giving a warm welcome to Arseny Zhilyaev.
Hello. Thank you, Brian, for introduction, and colleagues, thank you for organizing this symposium and the general support of Avant Museology, and thank you for coming. Obviously, if you have avant-garde and museology or museum in one sentence, especially in case of Western English-speaking audience, the first name that comes to mind is L. Lisitsky and his collaboration with Alexander Dorner in Hanover. Okay. Everyone who has an interest in experiments with display design has seen images of the abstract cabinet installed in Hanover in late 1920s. This masterpiece marks the limits of the known ambitions of the transformation of the museum of that time, associated with the cultural activity of a young Soviet state or even an international avant-garde in general. But needless to say that the majority of interpretations of the abstract cabinet reduced its meaning to formal innovations distinctive to Western modernism. The very concept of the museum that appeared as a result of new social relationships and a newly developed political agenda remains untouched. I'd like to take a risk to go beyond this limited discussion and describe the trajectory and logic of the transformation of the concept of the museum and art in general from the late 19th to the beginning of 20th century in Russia and the Soviet Union. This is the logic that without doubt fed Lisitsky experimentation, but yet cannot be reduced to it. Let's use the proletarian revolution in Russia as a point of departure for our discussion about avant-garde museology. This event determined the majority of interpretations of art and the role of institutions that should preserve art not only after the revolution itself, but also served as a point of attraction and establishment of social equality even before it took place. It will be easier to describe the hierarchy of radicalization of conception of the museum and its activity in relation to revolution. And as all we know, at the foundation of this hierarchy lays, of course, the destructive impulse of the historical avant-garde towards any attempt to preserve the past. And, of course, the artist who was in charge of this treatment is Kazimir Malevich. Malevich was closer to anarchism in terms of his political preferences. But at its core, this line of thinking, I mean this interpretation of artistic destruction of the museum, was inspired by the Marxist interpretation of artistic creation under the condition of capitalist production and its potential transformation after the revolution. After the revolution, it was understood the emphasis of artistic activity should gradually shift from the museum towards life and production. As the reasoning went, without social equality, art is mainly a ghetto for imaginary solutions of traumas that emerge as a result of exploitation and the class and ruling class violence against the oppressed. And the museum, in such a situation, fixes this order of things on an institutional level under the name of art history. Consequently, museum could be considered an enemy doomed to be destroyed. But if society has overcome the social contradictions associated with class struggle and inequality, then art as a bourgeois ghetto should melt into liberated reality. The artist, as a special professional occupation, should gradually give way to the engineer, be it an engineer of industrial machines or social interactions, as we had in case of constructivism and productivist movement in Soviet Russia. Fairly closely aligned with the radical position of Malevich was an attempt to destroy the concept of the museum as a castle of the enemy class culture expressed by prolet cult. Prolet cult is mainly described as a broad movement of unprofessional poets, writers, theatrical activists, film directors, and artists who tried to build a new proletarian culture through the negation of the art of previous epochs. And the intellectual leader of the prolet cult was a very interesting person named Alexander Bogdanov. We have his portrait here. He started off as a professional revolutionary and a close collaborator of Lenin. There is another one, famous photo with Bogdanov on the left, playing chess with Vladimir Lenin, and Maxim Gorky, one of the co-founder of socialist realism doctrine. Yeah, but later Bogdanov was forced to move away from political activity and started work as a scholar and cultural organizer. Thanks to Bogdanov, prolet cult was influenced by the ideas of Russian cosmism and, let's say, its unlimited creation. That's how a series of images of communistic space exploration were produced by self-taught poets. In the field of exhibition making, this intuition of radical freedom led, for example, to avalanche exhibitions. Worker-organized and continually argument exhibitions at factories that exemplified a possible depiction of a new museum after the destruction of the old class enemy institution. It is interesting to note that before revolution in 1908, Bogdanov depicted a less radical interpretation of the museum in communistic society in his science fiction novel Red Star, a chapter of which is included in books that we presented today. Bogdanov's version of the museum was later repeated by avant-garde artists and activists who could not support the full destruction of Malevich, but who tried to appropriate the museum for revolutionary propaganda and the purpose of displaying, let's say, good art, which was avant-garde art, of course, and serving as a center for the education of proletarian masses. In essence, the idea was to create a museum that could answer to the professional demands of pioneering artists, or to produce a museum of avant-gardism. The demands, however, focused principally on access to exhibition facilities and changes in the purchasing policy that would benefit innovative art. There was no talk of transforming the very role of the museum beyond a more active approach to exhibition and greater emphasis on the museum's undoubtedly important educational function. Thus, one of the important avant-garde theoreticians, Nikolai Punin, whose speech we had in Brooklyn, wrote, "The museum collections are archives to be consulted freely by anyone who wishes to do so. Let the paintings be hung and rehung without any interruption. Ideally, the museum must be made entirely of moving parts. Any tendency toward the stasis of the church icon must be eradicated." His colleague, Osip Brick, opined, "The contemporary museum is a scholar institute. One cannot breed contemporary European art museums out of the Kunstkammer and the repos any more than one can hatch the contemporary state directly from the feudal order. once museum had been repos, but already for a long time they have acquired a different character, an auxiliary scientific character. A professional version of the Avant-Garde Museum appeared in Moscow in 1990 in the form of the Museum of Painting Culture. The new institution was run by artists and mainly attended by a professional audience. The approach to organizing materials was close to what later was established by Alfred Barr at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Oh, sorry. In his polemical remarks on the Museum Bureau, the avant-garde artist Alexander Rodchenko proposes fundamental changes to exhibition strategies espoused by the Old Guard Museum. Quotation. First of all, the gallery and the wall are construed as equipment for displaying the artwork. Under such formulation, there can be no question of economy of wall space. Wall-to-wall coverage is categorically rejected. The wall is no longer construed as an autonomous entity. The artwork does not adapt itself to the wall. Instead, the artwork becomes an active participant. But of course, the Bolsheviks, as a real political government, could not support the demand for the destruction of the museum as avant-gardists and their less skilled colleagues from prolet cult wanted. Russia, after the revolution and the years of civil war, was a very weak and exhausted country, let's say. And it was especially important that artworks held not only cultural but also material value, which limited the revolutionary violence under these particular historical circumstances. Simple destruction was not a wise decision from a practical point of view, but avant-gardist appropriation of the museum as a tool for propaganda of their art also did not work very well. One possible solution to this dilemma was proposed by Leon Trotsky in his debates with prolet cult. His approach was somewhere in between early Bolshevik support of left-wing avant-garde art and later Bolshevik support of more traditional socialist realism. Trotsky claimed the necessity of appropriation and preservation of cultural treasures of the previous epochs because a new proletarian culture could not rise from an insufficient educational background or simply a lack of the access to museums. The fetishism of unskilled art production expressed by prolet cult is not enough to build a new culture and a new free human. And moreover, it conveys the negative consequences of avant-gardist destructive impulses. On the contrary, new artists descending from workers should bring back the cultural treasures which arose on the basis of stolen surplus value. But the crucial question here was how to use these treasures without commanding sympathy for antagonistic classes. And the experimental complex Marxist exposition proposed by Alexei Fyodorov-Davidov and mounted at the State Tretyakov Gallery in 1931 was supposed to resolve this dilemma. The idea was to contextualize art production according to different class positions that were expressed by various artworks. Fyodorov-Davidov constructed complexes, or let's say displays of different styles characterized by different class positions. Each display consisted a number of types of artistic mediums, including furniture. The exposition was built within a series of rooms with typical interiors of collectors from different class positions. And each room included supplementary materials about the economical and political specificities of each of them. Thus, the proletariat could better understand the connection between art and its social background. The experimental complex Marxist exposition worked similarly to alienation in the theater of Bertolt Brecht. It deconstructed the illusion of the museum as a temple of art, but left intact the possibility to learn from the masterpieces of previous epochs. In addition to art already recognized by capitalist museums, Fyodorov Davidov included works by peasants and proletarians, political slogans, and street advertisements. And for visitors who wanted to explore more advanced items, let's say professional development of artistic forms through history, Fyodorov Davidov organized special cabinets that repeated the logic of the avant-gardist museum of painting culture. Reappropriation of bourgeois culture with an educational purpose became a dominant model in Soviet museums for a short period of time between Lenin's death and Stalin's unfolding of the socialist realism apparatus. Dialectical materialism was named the principal method of museum activity. In the most general form, this meant that in contrast to the bourgeois museum of the past, its Soviet counterpart must treat natural history, social history of the cultural sphere not as alienated from the antagonistic or antagonistic to man, but as products of his or her conscious effort. The Kunstkammer, the vulgar materialistic or idealistic museum, would be replaced by the museum as an integral aspect of the artistic transformation of life. Passivity, neutrality, pseudo-positivist or metaphysical stances of the museum with respect to the phenomena within its purview would become a thing of the past. Political engagement, partisanship, direct participation in industrial processes, in the ongoing class struggle, critique of ideological superstition, critique of fetishism, these were the new guiding principles and slogans of Soviet museology of late 1920s, early 1930s. And here I have several pictures from that period and just like to shortly comment on them. For example, in this case we have one of the pictures from Museum of Revolution, and Museum of Revolutions were very important for me in this research. Because I guess museums of revolution have many in common with modernistic museums, but I think that they went even further than like classical museum of art. Yes, but it's like a big discussion about this topic, and here we have installation dedicated to dynamite workshop. Another important thing was mobile exhibitions, and exhibitions that took place not at museums but at factories, for example. And in this case we have photos of mobile laboratory one and the agitprop truck that went to distant villages in order to promote socialist construction and help peasants to grow better plants with exhibitions and special facilities. Another example dedicated to women liberation. I found even linked to Museum of Women Liberation in Soviet Union in 1920s, but unfortunately I could not find materials about it, but there are some just examples from that period about this topic. Another example from Leningrad, very interesting. It's a Museum of Atheism, another big and super important topic of that time. And here we can see how avant-garde display close to suprematism could be used for working as display of not artistic museums. Another example of museum of atheism with a famous quotation from Marx. Okay. Yes, but meanwhile, Marxist museums were not our final destination in my speech, and let's back up for a moment to the proletarian revolution and the dilemma of art after it. As Boris Arvatov, theorist of productivism, suggested, even when the social contradictions are resolved in advanced communist future, there will be a place for traditional media like painting and sculpture, because even advanced communists will be left with their physical bodies that caused possible traumas and other negative effects. And the strongest one is death and love of or sexual relations as an attempt to overwhelm death. And they need to be resolved, but only in the imaginary world of art, as Arvatov thought. And art, as we know, under capitalism. In this way, Arvatov was theorizing about the potential boundaries of avant-garde interpretation of post-revolutionary art, drawing them precisely at the point where the museum proposed by Russian cosmists was to begin. The museum starts with the victory over death, resurrection, and the overcoming of the need for traditional sexual relationships. The idea of the museum as a staging ground for transcending the limitations, both social and physical, imposed upon mankind can be traced back to the works of Nikolai Fyodorov, one of the most prominent exponents of Russian religious philosophy, originator of the philosophy of the common task and founding father of the Russian cosmism movement, which in large part inspired the Soviet space program. The idea of space colonization was a natural consequence of Fyodorov's conception of man as a transformational force in the universe, a kind of universal artist, the role of which imposes the necessity of regulations on nature and the cosmos. One of the key aspects of this process was the resurrection of the dead and subsequent resettlement of newly resurrected generations on the planets in outer space. Space exploration, however, was not a principal tenet of Fyodorov's teaching. His common task consisted of the need to assume direct control over the mechanisms of evolution and defeat death. At the same time, mere immortality would not suffice. The generation destined to triumph over death would nevertheless stand on the graves of all those who gave their lives in the service of this ideal. Thus, the blessed brotherhood of the sons would be forever indebted to the fathers. The ethical radicalism of the idea of indebtedness became the driving force behind Fyodorov's futuristic constructs. Creative transformation of the universe and its planets into spaceships, regulation of natural phenomena on the Earth and beyond, transcendence of humanity. These are some of the striking results of the idea that mankind must assume an active position with respect to the debt it owes its dead ancestors. And one of the central place in this agenda is occupied by the museum, understood in the broadest sense of the word as an institution that can be subsume all of man's activities in the service of the common task. Needless to say, the museum as it existed over the end of 19th century and the beginning of 20th century could not accommodate such an ambitious project. Fyodorov mounts a strident critique of traditional museum practices. He notes that the museum had often been used to enshrine mankind's poverty, strife, and misconception concerning its destiny. The museum of the future, on the other hand, must be construed as a place of reconciliation, an institution that, like the church, will register every new life and every new death, but the church, which proffers an important but so far illusory intuition of immortality, must extend it to other institutions, and thus be supplemented by the museum, considered as a research facility for the preservation and resurrection of every individual in his or her physical and mental totality. Hence, the need to combine the museum with a scientific laboratory, library, and church school. And again, I have several images related to this conception of museum and philosophy of Russian cosmism. And first image is image by Lev Solovyov, and this is a sketch to for his home resurrected museum, and it's really strange that even during Fyodor's life, he tried to realize his ideas in reality. He was principally against any mystification of his doctrine, so he created 6 exhibitions in Voronezh, and this case is another one. This is Lev Solovyov, who was his follower, and he organized museum in his home and dedicated to his dead wife. Another example of a resurrected museum. In this case, we have avant-garde artist Vasily Chikrygin, who was a close friend of Mayakovsky and founder of Makovets avant-garde movement. And he was big fan of Fyodorov's ideas and wrote brilliant poem on the temple of the Resurrected Museum, and did a lot of sketches for potential realization of this project in reality. And we even have correspondence from him to Nikolai Punin again about possible realization of this concept under Soviet government. But unfortunately, it didn't happen. Another interesting example, Pantheon of the USSR, that was proposed by Bekhterev, a famous psychologist and neurologist from Soviet 1920s, 30s. His idea was to create an institution that will preserve brains of main important people of USSR and later all people of the planet, with idea that we should research how their brains functioned. So it was really radical, but again, this project was realized somehow, but not under the name Pantheon of the USSR, but under the name Institute of Brain. And it still exists in Moscow. But during this presentation, I found several images on internet that one of the branch of this museum was abandoned, and it's how it looks right now, unfortunately. Yeah, but it's interesting that brain of Bogdanov, Tsiolkovsky, Bekhterev, Mayakovsky, Krupskaya, and many others important Soviet figures, their brains are still in the Institute of Brain. But there is no access to them, unfortunately. And one more picture, close to our reality. It's Anton Vidokl new movie, Immortality and Resurrection for All. And we will watch this piece today. And with this image, I'd like to emphasize that I consider avant-garde museology and, of course, museum, in case of Russian Cosmism, as kind of open projects, open for interventions of scholars, of artists, because I guess that today these ideas are pretty close to realities than it was 100 years ago. And our participation in a common task, let's say, could be very important for our potential eternal life, let's say. Thank you for listening. If you have questions, I can answer them. No? Okay. Okay.
As a Russian yourself, I'm curious if that last sort of story you talked about, the preservation of the brain, does that speak to Russian, something about the Russian self that echoes this the sort of supremacist uprising, outburst from 100 years previously? And are we seeing echoes of that now in a political sense, in the political theater, in the global theater right now?
Well, I don't know what to say.
It's kind of confused, but I guess I'm speaking to you about the Russian character and how it expresses itself.
You know, I'm not a big specialist in this question. I cannot evaluate Russian character, but what I can say is that, of course, this idea that appeared after proletarian revolution sounds today a little bit, you know, like a crazy. But I guess that right now we can understand that many ideas that appeared during this period right now are pretty close to reality. So they look like forecast of possible future. And it means that they look crazy only on the first glance. And then we can consider them as just prediction and very important ideas that appeared when limitation of our imagination just broke down. So, and you know, I think that we have, of course, this idea of Institute of Brain, but we have data centers run by IT corporations that collect all possible information about us, I guess including biological, because Google wants to establish medicine care branch. And we have secret services that collect, again, a lot of information about our lives. And all these things look pretty close to possible realization of Fyodorov's ideas, even more mad than just pantheon of the USSR. But of course, in case of Fyodorov, such type of interpretations were not possible because he was against capitalism and against any violence and political control and aggression. So it means that, again, maybe our days is not so far from the beginning of 20th century, and now, again, possible interventions and reinterpretations and struggle for the possible realization of this project is really important.
Hi, thank you
Hello.
for your talk. My question is about the lumpen proletariat, and if there was any part of a radical left imagination that considered the lumpen proletariat in this sort of avant-garde museology, and if not, why do you think that is?
Lumpenproletariat, I didn't hear well.
Yeah, I don't know. Should I rephrase or?
Yeah, if it's possible and louder.
This group that's sort of outside of Marx
Mhm.
thinking about the proletariat, this
Mhm.
lumpen proletariat
Mhm.
that's sort of cast out, disregarded, and thought to be not able to be politically activated.
Okay.
So in Avant Museology, there is this is a radical proposition. The spaces that they're thinking about, the ideas that they want to put forward. Where's the lump? Is there a lumpen proletariat
Okay,
in that
I got
radical
it.
imagination?
So, first of all, I can refer you to this Avalanche exhibition and Prolet Cult movement, because Prolet Cult movement was precisely about this type of lumpen proletariat, let's say, because they were like outsiders and they didn't have had not had participation in cultural policy before revolution. And yeah, and their activity were very problematic for Bolsheviks because they were even more popular than official supported avant-garde artists. And yeah, and then, for example, in case of Marxist expositions and Marxist museology, it is interesting that they consider them as kind of educational exhibitions, but of course they were close to really advanced conceptual critical installations. And for people who didn't have enough educational background, didn't have enough like participation in culture, they were very difficult to be understood somehow. So they criticize this as well, and I guess maybe it was one of the possible reasons why all this experimentation were closed in 30s, and instead of it was established more classical, traditional expositions that were more suitable for just ordinary people without background in art.
Hi, thank you for your talk. My question is, what is your take on the current contemporary museums in Russia? Like, given that they are being funded by government or by huge corporations like BP or BMW, do you think that there is still space for the concept of avant-garde museology?
Oh, in two words, I would say that
Maybe you know some contemporary examples, like some examples.
first,
Yeah.
it's really strange, but if you go in Moscow to a museum of contemporary Russian history, which is former Museum of Revolution, you can find more or less the same exposition from Soviet time. So they somehow preserved all their expositions from Soviet time. And it's really strange because it's not possible in public media in Russia to speak about revolution, censorship, etc., like struggle against censorship, against government. But in the very heart of the museum network, you can find all these materials: how to produce bombs, how to struggle against censorship, etc., etc. So there is a blind spot in this system. But I guess because of next forthcoming anniversary of proletarian revolution in next year, they will reconstruct all this exposition and try to find like another way for interpretation of these facts. And of course, I think that unfortunately there is no place for such type ambitious projects today, because it was possible, I guess, with strong support from government, from like revolution and social experimentations. But I think, and it's my like principal idea, that we can use contemporary art and even contemporary museums for experimentation in this field, because artist has a more broader freedom than curator from the museum, and possibly we can produce together like new interpretations of the same ideas that could be in future realized in like real museums after the revolution, of course. Okay, thank you, Anata.